Hello and welcome back to Skepticus. I am your host, Adam of Nola. Today we're delving deeper into the controversial claims that the Old Testament secretly, or not so secretly, reveals the divinity of the Messiah. Specifically, that the Messiah is Yahweh in person. This is part 2 of a series following their previous video on Old Testament divine plurality. The video we're responding to makes a bold assertion. It says that this isn't just Christian retrofitting. The Hebrew Bible itself, on its own terms, shows us a Messiah who shares in God's essence while remaining distinct from him. They aim to show that the Messiah isn't just a promised human king, but a divine figure, essentially Yahweh himself. We'll examine their key proof texts and interpretive methodologies. We'll explore alternative scholarly understandings of these passages, arguing that the video often takes poetic language, prophetic imagery, and the complex nature of divine manifestation in the Old Testament, and anachronistically reinterprets them through a New Testament trinitarian lens. Prepare to scrutinize the divine claims about the Old Testament Messiah, so let's begin.
In my last video, we looked at how the Old Testament gives us glimpses of divine plurality, multiple persons acting and being described as God, long before the New Testament makes it explicit. Now, in part 2 of this series, we're turning the spotlight onto one specific figure, the Messiah, not just as a promised human king, but as someone who is actually divine, Yahweh in person. This isn't just Christian retrofitting. The Hebrew Bible itself, on its own terms, shows us a Messiah who shares in God's essence while remaining distinct from him. Let's dive in.
This is the crucial claim we need to evaluate. Is it retrofitting, or is it genuinely on its own terms? The concept of a divine Messiah is central to Christian theology. If it can be found explicitly in the Old Testament, it lends immense weight to Christology. However, if it requires a specific post-New Testament interpretive framework to be seen, then it's precisely the retrofitting that they deny. The challenge is to differentiate between messianic prophecy that points to a human king or deliverer and prophecy that clearly identifies him as Yahweh. Let's dive into their first example from Daniel.
We'll start with a text that Jesus himself quoted to describe his identity. Daniel 7:13-14. With the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people should serve him. These are two figures here, both clearly divine. The Ancient of Days is Yahweh, but then there's this Son of Man figure who rides the clouds, a role reserved for God in the Old Testament, and he receives worship from the nations. That is not normal. This passage uses the Aramaic word palak, meaning divine service or worship, and when it's translated into Greek in the Septuagint, it becomes latreo, a word exclusively used for worship given to God. And it gets even deeper. In the ancient Canaanite religion, Baal was called the cloud rider. The Hebrew prophets took that title and applied it not to Baal, but to Yahweh. Isaiah 19:1, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud. Deuteronomy 33:26, he rides on the heavens in majesty. Psalm 104:3, clouds are his chariot. So when Daniel describes the Son of Man coming with the clouds, he's not describing someone who's merely human. He's a man, but he's wearing God's name tag.
This is a classic Trinitarian interpretation of Daniel 7, and it deserves careful scrutiny. The first problem is the Son of Man as a corporate figure. Let's think about the context of Daniel 7. While the Son of Man figure is certainly exalted and given cosmic authority, many scholars interpret him not as an individual divine person in the sense of the Christian Messiah, but as a corporate symbol for the holy people of the Most High. That's from Daniel 7:18-22. And 27. This collective saints or people are ultimately the ones who receive the kingdom. So the Son of Man figure represents the vindication and triumph of God's people, which are Israel, over oppressive earthly empires, symbolizing their ultimate reign under God. Even if taken as an individual, the text says one like a Son of Man, emphasizing his human appearance, distinguishing him from the Ancient of Days. He approaches the Ancient of Days and receives dominion, glory, and a kingdom, indicating a delegation of authority from God, not an inherent co-equality with God. The second problem is with this riding the clouds. It's imagery versus identity. The video correctly notes that cloud riding is imagery associated with Yahweh. For example, Psalm 104, verse 3, he makes the clouds his chariot. And Isaiah 19:1, see, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud. However, this is prophetic imagery conveying divine power and majesty, not necessarily claiming a shared identity between the Son of Man and Yahweh. The Son of Man comes with the clouds, not on them as a chariot like Yahweh. It signifies his heavenly origin and divine commission. Compare this to other instances of divine manifestation or representation. The angel of the Lord often acts with divine authority, but is still distinct from Yahweh. The Son of Man in Daniel is presented as a figure approaching God, not being God himself. And the third problem is with worship and the terms pala or latreo. While pala and latreo often refer to divine worship, the context of all nations serve him from Daniel 7:14 can also be understood as homage and submission to a divinely appointed ruler, rather than worship directed at a co-equal divine being in the Trinitarian sense. Kings in the Old Testament received homage and service. The focus in Daniel is on the transfer of universal dominion, where all peoples acknowledge the authority of the Son of Man's kingdom, which is ultimately God's kingdom. To leap from this visionary imagery of a delegated, victorious figure to an explicit claim of shared divine essence with Yahweh, as understood in Trinitarian theology, is an interpretive step that many non-Trinitarian scholars and Jewish interpreters do not make. They see a human-like, divinely appointed agent, not Yahweh in another form. Let's look at their next example from Isaiah 53.
Next up, we're going to go to somewhere a little bit unexpected. Isaiah 53 is one of the most quoted messianic prophecies in church history, and for good reason. It reads like a play-by-play of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. But here's what a lot of people miss. This servant in this passage doesn't just look like Jesus. He looks like Yahweh. In Isaiah 52:13, the servant is described as being high and lifted up and greatly exalted. That phrase is reserved in Isaiah for God alone. Isaiah 6:1, the Lord is high and lifted up. Isaiah 33:5-10, the Lord alone is exalted. Isaiah 57:15, God is high and lofty and is one who inhabits eternity. And in Isaiah 2:17, the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. So if the servant is exalted in the same way Yahweh is, then we're dealing with more than just a prophet. We're looking at a divine person.
The video goes through many verses, a lot of them from Isaiah 53, to conclude that if the servant is exalted in the same way Yahweh is, then he's a divine person. The first problem is with the phrase high and lifted up. While high and lifted up is used for Yahweh in Isaiah 6:1 and is a powerful descriptor of divine majesty, it's not exclusively reserved for God in every instance or context. It can refer to elevation or exaltation in a general sense, not necessarily identifying the subject as God. In Isaiah 30, verse 25, it says, "And on every lofty mountain and every high and exalted hill there will be brooks running with water," using the same Hebrew phrase for hills. In Isaiah 5:16, it says, "But the Lord Almighty will be exalted by his justice, and God who is holy will show himself holy by his righteousness." Here, God is exalted by his justice, not just inherently. The point in Isaiah 52:13 is the servant's vindication and exaltation by God after suffering. Not that he is God. It's an exaltation to a high position, mirroring God's own exalted status, but not equating their identities. The second problem here is with the identity of the suffering servant. Many Jewish and critical scholars interpret the suffering servant in Isaiah not as an individual divine person, but as Israel itself, the nation personified, or a faithful remnant within Israel, suffering for the sins of the nation and the world. In Isaiah 49:3, it says, "He said to me, 'You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will display my splendor.'" And in Isaiah 42:19, it says, "Who is blind but my servant, and deaf like the messenger I send?" This interpretation means that the exaltation is of the collective, not a distinct divine person. To say that the servant looks like Yahweh in this phrase is to interpret a shared attribute, exaltation, as a shared divine identity, which the text itself doesn't explicitly state. It requires a significant leap. Let's continue with their argument about the servant.
But it doesn't stop there. Isaiah 53:11 says the servant will justify many and bear their iniquities. Yet in Isaiah 45:24 through 25, Yahweh says, "In the Lord alone are righteousness and strength. In the Lord all the offspring of Israel shall be justified." And when we turn over to Isaiah 59:16, when no one else could intercede for sinners, God himself steps in and does it. Yet here in chapter 53, the servant also intercedes. So which is it? Only Yahweh can justify and intercede, or can someone else do it? The answer is yes. The servant is Yahweh, yet is also distinguished from Yahweh. That only makes sense in a Trinitarian framework.
So the first problem here is with the justification and intercession by proxy or delegation. The core of their argument here is that actions like justifying and interceding are exclusive to Yahweh. So if the servant does them, he must be Yahweh. However, this ignores the concept of delegated authority or acting as God's agent. In Isaiah 53:11, it says, "By his knowledge my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities." The servant justifies by his knowledge and bears iniquities through his suffering. This is consistent with a divinely appointed mediator, not necessarily God himself. Throughout the Old Testament, prophets, priests, and kings acted as God's agents, bringing his word, making atonement, and ruling on his behalf. In Leviticus 4, verse 20, priests make atonement for the people. In this way, the priest will make atonement for them, and they will be forgiven. Does this make the priest God? No. In Job 42, verse 8, it says, God tells Eliphaz to go to my servant Job and present an offering for yourselves, and my servant Job will pray for you. I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. Job intercedes and his prayer is accepted by God. Does this make Job God? Clearly not. The second problem comes in their contention that this only makes sense in a Trinitarian framework. This is the ultimate circular argument. They take actions that can be explained by a human agent acting on God's behalf, declare that they must imply divine identity if God also performs them, and then they conclude that this only makes sense within a Trinitarian framework. This is assuming the Trinity to prove the Trinity. Jewish understanding, which is overwhelmingly monotheistic, has no problem with God empowering or sending an agent to achieve his purposes, including justification and intercession. The Old Testament consistently emphasizes that salvation comes from Yahweh. If the servant justifies or intercedes, it is because Yahweh enables and empowers him to do so, not because the servant is Yahweh himself. Let's move to their next set of examples from Isaiah.
And there is a whole lot more in Isaiah. In chapter 9, the child to be born is called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, aka El Gabor, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. That phrase, Mighty God or El Gabor, is the exact title used for Yahweh himself in Isaiah 10:21. Then in chapter 11, Isaiah introduces a shoot from the stump of Jesse, David's family line. The Spirit of the Lord rests upon him. He judges with righteousness. He brings justice to the whole earth. Yet that same Spirit-filled justice-bringing branch shows up again in Isaiah 42, where God says, I will put my Spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. The same themes appear again in Isaiah 49. The servant is a light for the Gentiles, just like in Isaiah 11 and 42. But the servant is also rejected by the nation, just like he is in Isaiah 53. The simplest explanation is that the divine child of chapter 9 and the branch of chapter 11, the servant of chapters 42, 49, and 53, are all the same person, a human, but who also shares in the essence of God.
So they pile on more Isaiah passages. I won't reread them all here, but the first problem is with their interpretation of mighty God, which is El Gabor in Isaiah 9, verse 6. While El Gabor can be used for Yahweh, as in Isaiah 10, verse 21, for God destroying Assyria, The application of mighty God to the child in Isaiah 9:6 is still debated. So let's look at some contextual interpretations of that. Some Jewish and Christian scholars interpret this as a superlative human king who embodies divine attributes and acts with divine power, rather than being divine in essence. Kings were often given grand, even divine-sounding titles in the ancient Near East. Think of pharaohs or other rulers. Other interpretations see it as pointing to the divine nature of the Messiah. But it's important to acknowledge it's a contested point and not a definitive statement of shared essence in the way a Trinitarian would mean. It can mean a divinely empowered human. The second problem is the unified servant figure across Isaiah. The video's assertion that the child of Isaiah 9, the branch of Isaiah 11, and the servant of Isaiah 42, 49, and 53 are all the same person. This is a Christian theological synthesis. While these passages are messianic and speak of God's chosen agent, the Old Testament itself doesn't explicitly link them as a singular, pre-existent, divine figure in the way the New Testament connects them to Jesus. The servant in Isaiah can refer to Israel, the prophets, or an individual, or a smaller group of people other than Israel. The specific identification of all these figures with a single, divine, pre-existent Messiah is an interpretive choice made after the New Testament. And the third problem is with the Spirit of the Lord. The emphasis on the Spirit resting on the Messiah, as in Isaiah 11 and 42, is consistent with the Old Testament understanding of the Spirit empowering individuals for specific tasks. For example, prophets and judges like Gideon in Judges 6:34 or Samson in Judges 14:6. This demonstrates God's empowerment of the Messiah, not that the Messiah is God. These passages, while undeniably messianic and highlighting the unique power and mission of God's chosen deliverer, do not on their own terms, unequivocally declare the Messiah to be Yahweh in essence to a Jewish ear. They speak of a human figure uniquely empowered by God. And finally, they turn to Zechariah.
Finally, Zechariah gives us a famous prophecy. Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and riding on a donkey. This is the Messiah, righteous, saving, and peaceful. His rule stretches to the ends of the earth. But a few chapters later in Zechariah 14, it says, the Lord will go out and fight. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. Well, hold on a second. God has feet, and he stands on a mountain and splits it in two? This is Yahweh coming in physical form. Zephaniah, another Hebrew prophet, says that this being is the King of Israel, the Lord that is in your midst. This king is God, yet he's distinct from Yahweh, dwelling physically in the midst of Israel. I hope the picture is becoming pretty clear by now. In the next part of this series, we're going to dive even deeper, looking at the messenger of Yahweh, another mysterious figure in the Old Testament who speaks as God, acts as God, and yet is sent by God. And if that sounds familiar, it should.
So the first problem here is that Zechariah 9:9 versus Zechariah 14:3-4 are two different accounts and concepts. Zechariah 9:9 is widely accepted as a messianic prophecy of a humble king, often one that is fulfilled by Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, as in Matthew 21:5 and John 12:15. This king is explicitly riding on a donkey, indicating a human king. In Zechariah 14, verses 3-4, it describes Yahweh himself in a theophanic, which is a divine appearance, event, fighting for Jerusalem and literally standing on the Mount of Olives. This is a dramatic eschatological event describing God's direct intervention. The video connects these two by implying that the king of Zechariah 9 is the same Yahweh in Zechariah 14. But the text describes very different scenarios and actors. One is a human king. The other is Yahweh in divine manifestation. The leap that God has feet here must mean the Messiah is Yahweh in physical form, distinct from the Father, is a Trinitarian interpretation. The second problem here comes with distinct from Yahweh. The video claims that the King of Israel in Zephaniah 3:15 is God, yet he's distinct from Yahweh. Zephaniah 3:15 actually says, the Lord has taken away your punishment. He has turned back your enemy. The King of Israel, the Lord, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. The phrase, the King of Israel, the Lord, is likely apposition, meaning the Lord who is the King of Israel, or the Lord is the King of Israel. It does not necessarily imply two distinct divine persons. It reaffirms Yahweh's direct kingship over Israel. So here's the takeaway. This video attempts to build a case for the Messiah's divinity in the Old Testament, first by stretching interpretations, by anachronistic application, by ignoring text, and by conflating figures. In terms of stretching interpretations, taking passages that are ambiguous, symbolic, or refer to God's delegated authority and interpreting them as explicit statements of a divine or pre-existent Messiah. In terms of anachronistic application, this is reading New Testament Christology and Trinitarian concepts back into texts that predate these theological developments by centuries. In terms of ignoring context, this is overlooking the immediate literary and historical context of passages and Jewish interpretations in favor of a Christian theological agenda. And finally, in terms of conflating figures, this is synthesizing various prophetic figures, the Son of Man, suffering servant, the branch, the king, into a single divine pre-existent Messiah, a synthesis that is a product of Christian theology, not explicitly laid out in the Old Testament itself. While the Old Testament clearly contains prophecies about a coming Messiah, a chosen king or deliverer, it does not, on its own terms, explicitly present this Messiah as Yahweh himself, a distinct divine person, co-equal with the Father, as required by the doctrine of the Trinity. The proof texts that they present, while important for Christian theology, are consistently interpreted differently by Jewish scholars and critical biblical scholars who do not start with a Trinitarian presupposition. The picture becoming pretty clear is primarily clear for those who have already accepted the New Testament's later theological developments and are now seeking to find them woven into the older text. As I did in my previous video, I do want to make this clear. You may think that this is a little odd, being that I am an atheist and this is an atheist channel. So why is it that I care that much about one aspect of Christian doctrine versus those who argue for another aspect? But for me, this is particularly infuriating at times because there's enough crap around arguments and fighting and even at times wars as to what's in the Bible itself. The last thing that we need to be doing is adding this ridiculous interpretive lens that cannot be found in the text. And here's what I mean by cannot be found in the text. If you take someone off the street who has never heard of the Trinity and they have never read the Old Testament, and you sit them down and you have them read from the first page of the Old Testament to the last page of the Old Testament, then you quiz them deeply about what they've read, not a single person who undertakes that endeavor will come away from it with any idea about the Trinity. If you want to believe in the Trinity, that's fine. But understand that the Trinity is absolutely a post-New Testament doctrine that wasn't codified truly until a couple of centuries after the events that took place in the New Testament. The simple fact is that trying to go back and find aspects of the Trinity in the Old Testament is no different than me going back and telling you that I have found clear evidence in these verses of the flying spaghetti monster. And trust me, if I wanted to do that, I absolutely could. But that wouldn't change the fact that it would be absolute, complete, and utter bullshit. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. I hope that you have enjoyed this, or I hope it's pissed you off, or something in between. I hope that you like, subscribe, leave your comments below. If I have said anything incorrect, if I need to be set on the right path, then by all means, Yahweh or Jebus or someone, please, this is your chance. Set me straight. Anything? Anything, guys? Well, there you have it. This is endorsed by Yahweh and Jebus and the Holy Spirit and all of them, probably Vishnu too. So thank you for joining us. I hope to see you in the future on other videos. And until that time, lo, I say unto you, stay skeptical.